The first is that anomalous experiences are actually very common. They tend to be dismissed as exceptions or rare events, but the findings indicate that they are a normal part of human life experience. The series of 3 studies that I describe on paper that was just published is the most comprehensive investigation carried out so far on anomalous experiences in the U.S. general population. Fascinating. 2 of the studies were nationwide surveys of nationally representative samples of adults. Both of those population studies showed that about 4 out of every 5 Americans had at least some kind of anomalous experience repeatedly. Wow, 4 out of 5 people have anomalous experiences repeatedly. And in fact, most of them have multiple different kinds of such odd experiences again and again. In my view, this suggests that having anomalous experiences is something that should be considered part of the human, natural, psychological makeup of human beings. That's so important. I just can't help but wonder the amount of people that felt like they were alone and crazy their whole life before, and probably still do. But, not many people are going to read this article. But this article is saying to not feel that way, that actually society needs to catch up to our brains and our physiology. Society is behind the physiology of our bodies. Hello and welcome to Inspired Earth. It has definitely been way too long. I apologize for the hiatus. As you guys can probably imagine, I just needed to take some time and get my head straight to come back and do Inspired Earth. The Blitzkrieg, aka Schitzkrieg, aka flooding the field, as Steve Bannon said, one of Trump's old attorneys who went to prison for him for embezzling money from his base. He went out and said, we're going to flood the field and we're going to overwhelm everybody. We're going to paralyze everybody. And that's literally his words. And you can go and watch it. I mean, it's famous at this point. For the most part, a lot of people have heard the term flood the zone from him. Obviously, he's using sports terms to describe their political assaults on democracy. But so that was called a Schitzkrieg by some people jokingly. And I think that all took a toll on everybody, on all Americans for the most part, at the beginning of the year. And so I had to take a step back and do a lot of research and reading. And I'll talk about that for a little bit before I get onto the main course here, but I just wanted to kind of do some of the highlights that we have missed since our last recording, which I will also talk about that a little bit sometime. But Trump deportations have pretty much failed. Thus far. He has done some deportations. Obviously, we've been watching it in the news, sending people to El Salvador torture facilities that allegedly people don't even come out of. That facility has been documented for like a decade or two. People like Todd Miller that I had on the show last season can probably speak a whole lot about that, as well as others. There's a lot of literature already written on that topic of what the prisons do in the South America and how they're linked to our tax dollars and our military. So, in most regards, the Trump deportations have failed in the quantity that he had wanted them to be in. And we'll talk a little bit about that really quickly in this very beginning part. He also realized that we needed farmers and might take away the due process to speed up the deportations, because he said that basically everybody having a trial is what's slowing everything down. So he's going to try to take away people's rights to a trial or have any sort of facts represent cases or anything like that. his attack on international trade and shipping and international relations. Obviously, already having blowback. Tourism totally collapsing. You see that in cities like Las Vegas, and especially, I'm sure, on the East Coast more than the West. I mean, who knows? It's probably all of it. I think that's what the data shows. But you'd think Europeans would also definitely not want to come over here right now, as well as probably everybody else. But yeah, that's kind of just another signal that the economy is collapsing. The American empire that we've known it since 1945 is having these fractures form. It's kind of basically on the verge of collapsing, if not already collapsing. There's a lot of debate as to where we are in the collapse, but it definitely seems like it's happening. And all of our top officials are talking about preparing for war. You know, we have Seth Hegseth or Pete Hegseth. I can't even. I'm like confusing two people, but the Hegseth guy, Secretary of Defense, I'm pretty sure. The one with all the leaks, the two signal leaks. The first time that was real famous, and the second time he was like bringing his family to all these secret classified meetings and stuff, and using the wrong phone and apps, and they just don't care. That guy, if you go and read his first page of his book, he is talking about how we're in a holy war with the entire globe, and he's talking about the American nationalist Christian base that he believes has taken over the government or has always been in power of the government. Basically, he believes that this nationalist Christian crusade against the whole world needs to take place, and that's in the first page of his book. That we're in a holy war against Muslims, Chinese, gay people, black people, anybody who's not like a white male Christian. I guess we're in a holy war with, according to him. So they just want to go to war with the whole world at this point. You know, they're talking about invading Mexico, invading Canada, making them our 51st state. I don't know how Puerto Rico would feel about that, considering they're trying to be the 51st state for a while, or at least some people have advocated for that. But talking about invading Greenland, invading Iran. We had GOP talking about invading Denmark, invading Belgium to get to The Hague. Did I mention China? Oh, I've almost forgot North Korea. Probably North Korea as well. And Reuters has come out and said that. Oh, I forgot Panama. I knew I was forgetting one. But Reuters said that in a recent article, I'm not even going to pull it up just because it's garbage, had said that China would be at war on our home front, and we should prepare for a home front war with Chinese on our soil. And I just thought that was the most ridiculous article I've ever heard of in my life. As if we would let a single boot onto American soil before we just nuke the whole place. We would nuke the whole world before we had Chinese boots on American soil. But they don't even need to invade us. They can just sit back and watch what's going on right now. I mean, like I said, the American economy is collapsing. They don't need to invade us for everything to collapse. We've just done that to ourselves. But to talk about Chinese coming onto our homeland, that's not us winning the war. That's Reuters saying that we're going to lose the war with China and we need to prepare for a losing war. That's my takeaway. I would, like to hear somebody argue that Chinese boots coming onto American soil is not us losing the war. It's definitely not going good if that's how things are going to go, which I don't think they will. I'm just talking hypothetically from Reuters article. That was just from like 2 days ago or something like that. And I was just, that article is crazy. I mean, to talk about we need to get ready. No, we don't. We need to avoid a war with China that would lead to the world being nuked or having Chinese boots on the ground in American soil. That's just preposterous in every sort of way. But On to some more positive things. Trump has the lowest approval numbers in U.S. history since polls have been being taken, apparently. The only person that he's beat was himself from the first time. So that's kind of interesting. The third biggest protest in U.S. history occurred, was April 5th. Um, April 19th, I think there was another one. I think there's going to be some more June 5th and another one June 19th. So that ought to be interesting. Trump is talking about his birthday military parade that will cost millions of dollars and include paratroopers, apparently, as well as tanks, and people jumping out of the sky for his birthday. Um, as well, the India-Pakistan war was avoided, thankfully. I mean, that was nuts there for a while. So definitely some positive news there that Trump is running out of steam already. Um, his base is already really starting to second guess him. We have his Qatari plane here in Texas, like Central Texas, at our international airport, um, which they said is going to cost $7 billion just to outfit to be able for him to be able to fly in it. They've got to install all these defensive and hardening technologies onto it. So it's not even really a free gift. I would like to compare that to the cost of Air Force One and Air Force Two that he already has. But I guess he needs a flying palace, as they call it, or whatever. Even his own base is kind of upset about that. I'm pretty sure it's illegal, but I mean, the tariffs were illegal. Only Congress can put new taxes in, I believe. A lot of law experts have said, but I mean, he just can do whatever he wants at this point until he runs out of steam, which seems like he has. But enough with the highlights. I was just trying to roll through those super quick to get us caught up. With the books I've read recently, I was during that time off, I've just been reading a lot and studying a lot about a whole bunch of different things. And I got to tell you guys about 4 books that were incredible. Nazi Slaughter of the Disabled was one of them. That was an incredible book. It's about, obviously, as the title suggests, the Nazi slaughter of the disabled, but it also goes into how specific parts of the Catholic Church fought against the Nazi German empire at that time. Because I had mainly heard that the Catholics, I guess this is just super high level Catholic people, had capitulated with the Nazis. There's a lot of books written about the Vatican working together with the Nazis, but in this book, Nazi Slaughter of the Disabled, it talks about this group of Catholic people that had infiltrated the SS to document and sabotage the euthanasia program at the beginning, and goes into a whole lot about how you can criminalize mental illness, and it, like, anytime you disagree with the state, they can call that a crime, basically. And kind of linking to that was another book, We Are All Neurodiverse, which explains that same concept a lot more in depth, that if you disagree with the government, even here in America, like much more recent than Nazi Germany, even after the Nazis were defeated here in America, we had changed all of these laws, specifically like schizophrenia, or laws about schizophrenia, to make it to where we could go and arrest people for involved in the civil rights movement, fighting for their own rights. Like, for example, black males who say that they're being persecuted by the system. That is a symptom they added to schizophrenia so that they could lock up large amounts of black people or any sort of colored people into institutions to make them to where they couldn't fight for their rights anymore. And the same thing happened to black women, that up until 1970s they were sterilizing black women for being disagreeable with the status quo of the way our society functions. So they were saying that they wanted to be treated equally, and we thought that they were insane for that. And it even goes back to slave times, that anytime a slave would try to run away, they thought that they were mentally ill because they were the masters, the white racial oppressors of that time. That was the majority of society, had determined that black people are inherently slaves, and that's like their biological purpose on this planet is to be subservient, and anybody who didn't want to do that is obviously insane, and they needed to be dealt with accordingly. So it even goes back to slave times, of the act of using mental illness to persecute political dissidents. And I'm sure it has a even further back than that. It has examples of that. But another book was Night. It's a Pulitzer Prize winning book. I'm sure a lot of people have already read it. I had not read it, or at least I didn't remember reading it. But it's interesting because Nazi Slaughter of the Disabled as well as Night are both about the Holocaust. Night won a bunch of awards. Night is very short. It's a very short book, but both of them talk about the link to deportations, which I said we would talk about again, of them taking away due process rights. Well, the Nazis started with deportations. They didn't just immediately start with euthanasia or mass extermination. They started with deportations, and the deportations failed. And that was whenever they shifted to extermination. And they made it as a wartime effort, which is exactly what our current administration in America is doing. Is they're linking all of this with a wartime effort. You go and listen to whoever the guy was. I don't even care to know his name. That was talking about eliminating these rights on the news recently. The bald guy. He was even saying that this is a wartime measure. All of the immigration stuff that Trump has been saying, they're all linking it to wartime, and that's his justification for using these powers. So I just wanted to point that out, that it's very similar and parallel in some areas. And it's also an inspiration for resistance, because the Nazis and the Slaughter of the Disabled program had a lot of resistance from the inside of Germany itself for years. So it's a very interesting tale with that book. I had not read a lot of it or heard of a lot of this before, and I've studied World War II and the Holocaust like almost my whole life. And there's so many more details and stuff that's coming out, at least for me, that I'm learning, that I can't even imagine how we didn't get taught this stuff in school. But lastly, The Jungle by Upton Sinclair. Again, a very famous book. I'm sure a lot of you guys read about that in school, just like I did. But in school, we never read the book. We just talked about what was in the book. And I can kind of understand why they would not want to read the book, because it's got some pretty graphic moments. I mean, not overly so, but it's about a meatpacking factory in like 1905 Chicago. So as you can imagine, it's pretty brutal stuff. But the writing of that book is what actually led to regulations in the meat industry, that we shouldn't be selling ground up mice with rat poison in them in our sausages that we feed our children, or uh, all sorts of extremely crazy stuff like selling green meat and stuff like that. Um, so yeah, I really enjoyed The Jungle. It gave me like a whole new appreciation for life. It was an intense book. It's fairly short, but it was very, very good. So I just had to give some reading recommendation so that we're kind of all on the same page. Those four books were really good. I think all in all, that's less than 30 hours of listening if you're doing audiobooks at just normal speed. You could speed it up. But so I'm going to get to our articles today, and we've got something pretty interesting here. From May 13th, Cognitive Science by Eric W. Dolan on Psychology Post or PsyPost. Study links anomalous experiences to subconscious connectedness and other psychological traits. So, obviously, people that have listened to the show from a long time ago might remember the Schumann resonance and that our brains are all interconnected. The two hemispheres are connected to one another, and that there's like a middle energy that balances the two out that comes from the earth, and that's all like magnetically that's going on. So it really doesn't surprise me that there's this new test or whatever that tests for that sort of stuff. If you remember Gary Nolan, I'm pretty sure I've talked about this before. Gary Nolan was Stanford Medicine that talked about specific parts of the brain that are involved with psychic activity, like the caudate and the putamen, and that some of those regions are also affected with certain neurodiversity disorders, such as ADHD, and that he had linked those specific organs with anomalous experiences. And I'm calling them organs loosely, like organ parts of the brain regions might be the better term. But so this is like a assessment, like a paper assessment, not an imaging assessment. But they're talking about the same thing. So this is really exciting here that we have a new entry into the books. A new series of studies suggests that unusual experiences like premonitions, deja vu, and out-of-body sensations are not rare but instead quite common, and that people who report them often share distinct psychological traits. The research published in the journal Psychology of Consciousness, Theory, Research, and Practice found that individuals high in a trait called subconscious connectedness were significantly more likely to report frequent anomalous experiences. These experiences were also associated with traits such as dissociation, magical thinking, absorption, and intuitive thinking, which, if you were to compare that with other neurodiversity disorders or quote unquote mental illness diseases, you would see that those align really well. And this is where I would also suggest the book We Are All Neurodiverse again, because the author, she talks about this sort of stuff, not the paranormal, but like everything else that we're talking about is involved, and then you just can extrapolate on the data that she's talking about with this whole paranormal thing, because it meshes so perfectly. It really doesn't take a lot of imagination. You're just adding on like a Lego piece, like clicking that little piece into everything, and all of these other traits, which is interesting that they use that, are involved in that sort of stuff. And she makes the argument that society needs to be more welcoming to these sorts of experiences and people who have these sorts of traits, as societies and civilization in the past have been. Because we are pretty much the only civilization that we know of that pathologizes these sorts of things the way that we do. And I've talked about pathology being not necessarily the best way to think about these sorts of things in the past, and that book also goes into that a whole lot. So that was really exciting to hear people talking about that, and that they have been for a couple years. It's a relatively new book, but it's not like brand new. It's only a couple years old, so check that out. Maybe I should try to email the author or something like that. But anomalous experiences are events that seem to go beyond what conventional science can explain. These include extrasensory perceptions, vivid or unusual dreams, perceived telepathic events, or an unexplained sense of presence. While such experiences are often dismissed as illusions or signs of mental illness, some researchers argue that they are widespread in the general population and deserve more scientific attention. The new study was designed to better understand what kinds of people are more likely to report such experiences and how those experiences might be related to underlying psychological traits. I have been formally studying the personality trait of subconscious connectedness for several years. It is a line of research that indicates that some people have much closer connection with the non-conscious or subconscious parts of the brain than other people, meaning that their consciousness and their subconscious mind influence each other to an unusually high degree in everyday life, said study author Olafur S. Paulson, professor emeritus of medicine at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And Carl Jung had talked about this a whole lot. So it's very Jungian type philosophy, but I agree with it a lot. This can measure with a questionnaire called the Thought Impact Scale, which I developed and validated. By using scores on that scale, people can be reliably divided into those with high, moderate, and low subconscious connectedness. It is a personality characteristic that is normally distributed in the general population. Having high subconscious connectedness seems to be associated with a range of specific personal tendencies and behaviors, and I have been investigating those systematically in several studies. These side effects, so to speak, of high subconscious connectedness included greater proneness to engage regularly in creative or artistic activities, higher hypnotizability, and being more likely to seek hypnosis treatment, and greater probability of experiencing certain stress-related physical health problems such as irritable bowel syndrome and migraine headaches, which again is pretty interesting because if you compare that to other disorders, it's a huge overlap there. And it goes to show that our brain and body are not just two separate vessels and that they are interlinked within one another. And apparently even more so than we could even imagine beforehand with this whole subconscious twist. I'm not sure most people would think that irritable bowel syndrome has a subconscious root, but here it seems like it possibly could have some sort of effect, at least to a degree. Or migraines or whatever. I think migraines are probably a little bit more obvious that people get stressed out and they have a migraine, but a tendency to have a lot of unusual life experiences is another characteristic that I have long suspected to be associated with high subconscious connectedness. Anomalous experiences are a broad and heterogeneous class of phenomenon that simply have in common that they are things that people sometimes experience that are outside of the conventional framework of understanding of how the world operates. I noticed many years ago that clients in my practice as a clinical psychologist who showed indications of high subconscious connectedness seemed to spontaneously report various anomalous experiences more than my other clients. For example, they more often describe being able to sense the thoughts of other people's, having predictive dreams, experiencing highly improbable and very meaningful synchronicities, or having out-of-body experiences. Paulson continued. This observation led me to conduct a series of 3 studies to examine whether greater proneness to anomalous experiences is indeed a side effect of having high subconscious connectedness. That's very interesting. And with the whole synchronicities part, I think that that's been under a lot of scrutiny by scientists. Or scrutiny might not be the best word, or maybe it is, but a lot of them have been researching that sort of stuff and finding that there's a lot to it. And I'll just say this quickly, that I think that certain intelligence agencies have been looking at this sort of stuff for a long time. And there's a lot of literature to show that. And they're very curious in it. And I think that some of them may have evolved some sort of advanced diagnostic capabilities whether it's imaging, like we talked about with the MRI, Gary Nolan, or whether we're talking about a written test like this, maybe a combination of both and more, that these intelligence agencies can pick who have these sorts of abilities based on the events in their life as well as the assessments that they can put people through. And whatever result, I guess you get triaged and dealt with accordingly of whatever goal they have for those sorts of people and if you would fit. And that's just my speculation. I think that has to do with who gets taken. If you guys remember the missing 411 missing people episode, I think that could have to do with that, of how they know who to take. And there could be a lot of reasons why certain people are taken, whether it be their blood or their mind. But Powson conducted three separate studies involving over 2,200 adults in the United States. The first study was a pilot involving 216 participants from a university community. The second and third studies were large, demographically balanced online surveys conducted within nationwide samples, 500 people in Study 2 and 1,500 in Study 3. All three studies used the newly developed Unusual Experience Questionnaire, which asked people about 13 types of anomalous experiences and how often they occur. Examples include sensing someone is watching you before you turn around, having predictive dreams, or noticing meaningful coincidences that seem too unlikely to chance. The team also used the thought impact scale to assess the psychological trait of subconscious connectedness. Paulson found that the people with high subconscious connectedness reported more anomalous experiences than those with low scores on the thought impact scale. In all three studies, the difference between high and low scores was not just statistically significant, it was large. For example, in the nationally representative Study 3, people with high thought impact scale scores reported on average more than 3 times as many repeated anomalous experiences as those with low scores. So 3 times as many. In fact, 86% of participants in that survey said they had experienced at least one of the anomalous events more than once. The correlation between the thought impact scale scores and the amount of anomalous experiences was moderate to strong across all three studies. Moreover, every single one of the 13 experiences listed in the Unusual Experience Questionnaire was more common among people with high subconsciousness connectedness, ranging from deja vu to feelings their thoughts had influence over certain people's behavior. What surprised me the most was to see how many adults have certain anomalous experiences again and again, Paulson told SciPost. The most common of these repeated experiences was deja vu. That is, the sense that one is experiencing in the present moment what has happened before, when that is not possible. About 60% of people in the U.S. national population samples reported having deja vu at least a few times, and between 40 and 50% of all the people surveyed reported that they had at least a few times since correctly being stared at before looking, having a premonition that came true, and objects oddly disappearing and showing up later in places they had already looked for them. Wow, that's interesting. Those are called apports, if you don't know the name of that. A person having such peculiar experience once can perhaps be dismissed as a misperception or imagination, but to see that a large portion of the general population experiences particular anomalies again and again over time is eye-opening to me, and suggests that these phenomena warrant far more research. Most surveys of anomalous experiences have unfortunately only asked whether people have ever experienced what is described, but not how often it occurs. This is a mistake. For if some subjective experience happens repeatedly over time, it is a psychological tendency and likely says something about the state of mind of the people who have the experience. Or the mind, not the state of mind. Maybe both. But subconscious connectedness wasn't the only trait linked to these experiences. In the first and third study, Powelson also measured several of the other personality traits previously associated with the anomalous experiences. These included absorption, becoming fully immersed in thoughts or sensory experiences, which that's like hyperfocus, disassociation, feeling detached from oneself, fantasy proneness, faith in intuition, or magical ideation, the belief that one's thoughts can influence the world, and belief in paranormal phenomenon. Again, if you were to compare that with like ADHD, those are just different ways of describing different traits. And I thought that it was interesting he used the word traits here, not symptoms, because if you were to call those symptoms, we would have a totally different like mental context with that, uh, rather than the word traits. Those are significantly different connotations. And for people that experience this stuff, they've been told their whole life that they're sick, or there's something wrong with them, or they're damaged, or they're broken. In fact, that's what RFK was just telling everybody. RFK Jr. telling everybody that autistic people are broken, that they'll never have a job, uh, they'll never pay taxes, they'll never write a poem, they'll never go on a date, they'll never own a home, as if that's not even true. I mean, somebody, I like the comedian that was telling RFK to get a Netflix account and watch Love on the Spectrum. Like, just because you don't know that autistic people date does not mean that autistic people won't date or have a family or whatever. That's just plain ignorance. And the reason that he talks about never seeing elderly people with autism is because of what I was talking about earlier, that they would institutionalize them. They would put them away and kill them. And that's what we did with the mentally ill for a long time. And even before we had institutions, they would just lock them in the cellar because they were like ashamed of it, that their family would be dishonored by having a disabled person or whatever. This is how people thought for a long time, at least in the West. So I just had to point that out. Powelson also explored how these experiences relate to mental health and the well-being. People who reported more anomalous experiences tended to report more stress, anxiety, and depressive symptoms, i.e., somebody is more sensitive. So they would have that sort of reaction, especially with what's going on around here. And again, going back to ADHD, autism, and a huge brand of disorders, they are more sensitive people. So it makes sense. However, the correlations were modest. The number of anomalous experiences was only weakly related to lower happiness and had no clear relationship with perceived quality of life. These findings suggest that while unusual experiences may be more common in individuals with higher emotional distress, they are not necessarily impairing or distressing themselves. See, that's fascinating right there. That is really fascinating. And I can't remember if I've talked about this or not, but I've noticed a link between paranormal anomalous types of stuff and suffering or sufferation. And this is just like a scientific way of saying that people with higher emotional distress, which I kind of already talked about the root cause for that, but people who are having hard times having paranormal experiences, that's something I've noticed for a long time. It's very interesting. They have some data representing that. Demographic patterns also emerged. Across the two nations' surveys, younger adults reported more anomalous experiences than older adults. The highest prevalence was found in participants under 50 years old, while people over 65 reported the fewest. Some racial and ethnic differences were also found. In the third study, black participants reported more anomalous experiences than white participants, while Hispanic participants fell in the middle. And that's interesting. I would be very hesitant to make any sort of like generalizations or anything like that about race and the paranormal, but I have noticed some links like that, but it's hard for me to say exactly what's going on with those. I would say that it's possible that because just statistically white people are more likely to finish school and like that, at least in the past, that maybe white people would try to like brush it off as like some sort of scientific thing, like that they have an explanation for it or there is some sort of explanation for it, whereas Hispanic and black people um, might put it more towards like a spiritual or religious thing more quickly. uh, I'm not sure. Again, that's pretty sensitive territory. I think that we need to be careful talking about racial and ethnic differences, but I do think that there's room for that exploration because from what I've seen just in electronic voice phenomenon, that there is stuff going on that is racial in varying degrees. So that's something that I think deserves at least a little bit of very nuanced, cautious exploration. But I think this is continuing on. I think there are two more important points that emerge from this work for the general public, Paulson explained. The first is that anomalous experiences are actually very common. They tend to be dismissed as exceptions or rare events, but the findings indicate that they are a normal part of human life experience. The series of 3 studies that I describe on paper that was just published is the most comprehensive investigation carried out so far on anomalous experiences in the U.S. general population. Fascinating. 2 of the studies were nationwide surveys of nationally representative samples of adults. Both of those population studies showed that about 4 out of every 5 Americans had at least some kind of anomalous experience repeatedly. Wow, 4 out of 5 people have anomalous experiences repeatedly. And in fact, most of them have multiple different kinds of such odd experiences again and again. In my view, this suggests that having anomalous experiences is something that should be considered part of the human, natural, psychological makeup of human beings. That's so important. I just can't help but wonder the amount of people that felt like they were alone and crazy their whole life before, and probably still do. But, not many people are going to read this article. But this article is saying to not feel that way, that actually society needs to catch up to our brains and our physiology. Society is behind the physiology of our bodies and our understanding of ourselves. Our consciousness of our own bodies and minds is severely lacking. But I mean, that's kind of obvious with today's stuff, but I guess some people need to hear that. But it really does nail it home. It's not just like a extrapolation. It's like this is the data showing that. So some people are very scientific minded and not willing to take it a step further, but this will guide them through that, I guess. The second important takeaway from this research is that I think people vary greatly in regard to the extent to which they have odd life experiences. Paulson said, proneness to having anomalous experiences is most likely a stable personal characteristic over time, and is probably determined in large part by how much people's consciousness and subconscious minds communicate with each other in everyday life. What this means is that if you are a person who frequently has anomalous experiences and you have a friend who rarely or never has such experiences, that particular difference between you will probably still be there for years from now. That's interesting. Paulson's cautions that while the findings are robust, they do not prove the subconscious connectedness causes anomalous experiences. It is possible that both are influenced by other underlying factors, or that people who are more open to experiences are simply more likely to notice or recall unusual events, which is kind of what I was talking about with the whole science versus spirituality and religion thing with race. Another limitation is that the unusual experiences questionnaire does not cover all possible anomalous experiences, such as religious visions, communication with the dead, or UFOs. So the findings may not apply to those domains. That's also very interesting that they omitted those. The main limitation of this research is that I used a short questionnaire and 3 survey studies to measure anomalous experiences, Paulson noted. It is therefore unclear whether the findings apply to all these types of anomalous experiences. For example, we cannot know for sure whether seeing ghosts is related to being high on the physiological trait of subconsciousness, psychological trait of subconsciousness, because my surveys did not ask people whether or how often they have seen such ghosts. However, because all 13 types of anomalous experiences that were measured in my surveys show a robust association with high subconscious connectedness, it seems likely that other such experiences are also more common for people with high scores on that trait. The authors hope their findings will encourage more scientific attention to these experiences and promote a better understanding of their psychological roots. Whether or not anomalous experiences reflect hidden aspects of reality or just quirks of the human mind, they appear to be deeply woven into how many people experience the world. That's very fascinating. Like, why haven't we ever heard this before? I continue to actively pursue research to enhance understanding of the effects of having high or low subconscious connectedness, Paulson said. In regard to anomalous experiences, future studies will aim to examine what specific cognitive differences relate to high subconscious connectedness results in proneness to having anomalous experiences. Sorry, I'm getting back into the game of reading. I'm like getting tongue tied as I'm reading. So that was really fascinating, and I can't wait to hear some more. I feel like I need to come back and talk about this another time and like maybe a broader scope of things, because this is basically just talking about the paranormal is a form of neurodiversity, is what this just said without saying that sentence. If you take all of that stuff and you boil it down, you get the fact that certain people's brains are different than other people, and that's called neurodiversity. So to say the paranormal is basically all about neurodiversity is factually correct. I mean, we see that now. So I don't think, I've never heard that from anybody, but it's becoming more and more obvious. And I thought about this like, was it like 5 years ago, like maybe even over half a decade ago, that paranormal stuff has to deal with neurodiversity in some aspect, some sort of intersectionality with it. So I'll leave it at that, and we'll move on to something super quick. Rain could be a clean way of generating lots of electricity. Water falls on Earth every day as rain, and now scientists seem to have found a way of using it to create renewable energy. Water droplets fall through a tube have generated enough electricity to power 12 LED lights. Such an approach could one day be used in roof-based system to harvest lots of clean power from the rain. Rain falls on Earth every day. All the energy is wasted due to a lack of a system to harvest rain. Normally, when we generate electricity from water, we use the movement of it, and lots of it, to drive a turbine in a river or sea or even in a drinking water pipe. But water flows over an electric conductive surface, can generate its own electrical charge through a process called charge separation. This is driven by positively charged protons of the water molecules staying in the liquid and negatively charged electrons being donated to the surface, much as you can generate static electricity by rubbing a balloon on your hair. The phenomenon is usually an inefficient way of generating electricity because of the electric charge is created only on the surface of the water it touches. And if you use micro or nanoscale channels to increase the surface area, you end up requiring more energy to pump the water into them than you get out. Now, So and his colleagues have created a simple setup that relies on gravity to move water down a vertical tube that is 32 centimeters tall with an inner diameter of 2 millimeters. Water flows out of the bottom of the container via a horizontal stainless steel needle, then falls toward the tube below, As the rain-like water droplets collide at the top of the tube, they capture pockets of air, creating what is called a plug flow as they fall. This just disjointed flow seems to help the electrical charges of the water molecules separate as they travel down the tube. Wires at the top and bottom of the tube then harvest the generated electricity. In an experiment, one tube produced 440 microwatts. When researchers used 4 tubes at once, they powered 12 LEDs for 20 seconds. We can, for the first time ever, harvest the energy of the rain or other natural sources such as rivers or waterfalls via charge separation at the solid liquid surface. The amount of electricity generated might not seem particularly impressive, but so says the setup converted more than 10% of the energy of the falling water through the tubes into electricity, which is 5 orders of magnitude more electricity than obtained from water flowing through the tubes in a continuous system. So it sounds like they're getting better. Rain falls from a few kilometers into the sky to the earth. So there's a lot of room in three-dimensional space to harvest energy. This suggests that the system could be used to generate electricity from the rain, perhaps on rooftops. If it could be developed in a way that could be useful on a house-by-house basis, that could be a really useful thing, says Shannon Ames at the Low Impact Hydropower Institute in Boston. And this was from newscientist.com, written by Chris Sims, April 16th, 2025. So that's it on this one. I'm going to try to make it, it's almost to an hour. I tried to make it a little bit shorter, but I wasn't able to. But yeah, I'll make some more coming up. I'm looking forward to making more stuff. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that and leave it as a surprise. So I'll make some more stuff. Oh, I've been working a whole lot, like 60-hour weeks. Normally this time of year, it would be slow, but this year is just different. There's just something about this year with everything going on that the timing is different this year. So I'm happy to have the overtime and make a bunch of money, even though it's hard. Need to pay a lot of bills. So yeah, and hopefully I'll be going to school soon. So wish me luck on that. And I'll catch up with you guys later, and I'll update you when some more videos come out.